It's November the 24th, 1971. A mysterious figure enters Portland International Airport. He calmly approaches the ticket desk and he buys himself a one-way ticket to Seattle. Later that evening, in the skies above the Pacific Northwest, this routine flight to Seattle was to take a shockingly unexpected turn. This mysterious man, who was operating under an alias of D.B Cooper, was about to attempt one of the most daring hijacks in aviation history. It was the audacity of his demands that shocked negotiators on the ground before D.B Cooper eventually vanished into thin air. It's now been over 50 years and this still stands as one of the greatest unsolved crime mysteries of our time. Join us as we share the legendary story of D.B Cooper. Welcome to Mysteries Retold.
Ground control. We have a situation here.
There's no sign of him in here, sir. He's gone.
We're receiving reports of a skyjacking on a Boeing 727 that took off from Seattle this afternoon.
The man D.B Cooper then made an escape for it. The FBI ground teams continue the search for Cooper, but authorities fear he could be long gone by now.
While the FBI scratch their heads, the case of D.B Cooper is a real mystery.
A reward for any information leading to the capture of Cooper.
Where on earth is D.B Cooper? The investigation continues.
It's the eve of Thanksgiving, 1971, and it's one of the busiest days of travel in the United States. A man approaches the ticket office and buys a one-way ticket on flight 305, heading from Portland to Seattle. The man pays in cash and lists his name as D.B Cooper. D.B Cooper's smartly dressed. He's wearing a black suit with a white shirt and a thin black tie. He has polished brown shoes, and with him, he carries a briefcase and a brown paper bag. There's very little in the way of security checks, so D.B Cooper sails through and takes his place on board flight 305. Mr. Cooper sits on the very back row of the plane, and the flight takes off on time at about 2:50 in the afternoon. It's not long after takeoff that Cooper orders himself a bourbon and 7-Up, sits back and lights a cigarette. Nothing seems too out of place. Yet. A further 25 minutes or so passes, and Cooper then stops one of the cabin crew, a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. He hands her a rolled up note. Schaffner takes the note and at first puts it in her purse. In Schaffner's experience, it was a relatively common occurrence to be handed telephone numbers from male passengers, and Schaffner presumed this is exactly what was happening. Little did she know at that point, she was about to be involved in one of the most famous crime mysteries of all time. Cooper quickly realises that Schaffner hasn't even looked at the note, so he calls her over, leans in and whispers,
"Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb."
Schaffner immediately goes to her purse and retrieves the note, opens it and can see the message neatly written in capitals using a felt-tip pen. It says, "I have a bomb in my briefcase and I want you to come and sit next to me." Schaffner wastes no time and does just that, taking the empty seat next to Cooper. Cooper lifts up his briefcase, opens it, and reveals to Schaffner 2 rows of 4 red cylinders, which she assumes is dynamite. They were wired to a large battery, and as far as she was concerned, it was clearly a bomb in the suitcase. Cooper asks Schaffner if she understands the situation, to which she replies yes, and Cooper then starts to relay his demands. Schaffner writes these down and takes them straight into the captain's cabin. Cooper has requested $200,000 American in a knapsack, and he wants it no later than 5 p.m. Along with the $200,000 American, he wants 4 parachutes, 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes. Schaffner hands over a note where she's written the demands to the captain of the airline, Mr. William Scott. Captain Scott immediately responds. He orders Schaffner to stay in the cockpit with him. Scott then calls Seattle Airport and informs them of the situation. he makes an announcement to the other passengers that there's going to be a short delay due to a minor technical difficulty. As you can imagine, on the ground it's bedlam. Authorities rally and debate how to manage the situation. Can they intercept the flight? Do they have to abide to Cooper's demands? After much debate, and due to the gravity of the situation with the hostages, they decide that they're going to have to provide the money and source the parachutes for Cooper. With Cooper's plan now in motion, he orders the second airline assistant, a woman named Tina Mucklow, to sit with him and requests she stays with him for the remainder of the flight. According to Mucklow, Cooper wasn't particularly aggressive and actually seemed like quite a nice man during the flight. She recalls that Cooper even said to her,
"It's not because I have a grudge against your airline. I just have a grudge."
It's now 5:24 in the evening, slightly behind Cooper's schedule, and the ground finally let Captain Scott know that they've sourced the money and the parachutes and they're clear to land. They were going to provide Cooper 10,000 unmarked $20 bills and the 4 parachutes as requested. Authorities had ensured that they'd recorded all serial numbers on the notes, and each one began with the letter L. Should Cooper get away with this will be easier to track the money in the future. Seattle police had obtained the 2 front reserve parachutes from a local skydiving school, and the 2 main back ones were parachutes from a local stunt pilot. At 5:46 p.m, Flight 305 finally lands, and with Cooper's permission, Captain Scott parks the aircraft on a partially lit runway, which is situated slightly back from the main terminal. Cooper demands that only one representative of the airline approach the plane with the parachutes and the money, and the only entrance and exit would be through the aircraft's front door via mobile stairs. With Cooper's instructions, it's Mucklow that exited the aircraft through the front door, retrieves the ransom money, and brings it right to the back row to Cooper. Cooper inspects the money, all seems to be in order, and now Mucklow sat next to Cooper again and jokingly asks him if she can have some of that money. Mucklow recalls that Cooper turned round and immediately said yes, and handed her a wad of cash. She declined the cash and said it was against company policy. Mucklow also recalls that this isn't the first time that Cooper had made a gesture towards the staff. He'd offered to buy them all a drink and tip them out of his own pocket. Again, staff had declined this offer, saying it's against company policy and they can't accept anything from passengers. Mucklow then makes 3 additional trips in and out of the plane to collect the remaining parachutes. With the parachutes, Mucklow had also received a set of instructions on how to use them. She handed the instructions to Cooper, and Cooper told her to get rid of them as he didn't need instructions. It was at this point that another flight attendant named Alice Hancock asked if her and Schaffner can get off the plane. Cooper replied,
"Yeah, okay, whatever you girls want."
They left the plane, and Cooper then gave permission for all the civilians to be evacuated. This left just Cooper and 4 remaining members of staff on the plane, including Mucklow and Captain Scott. The second takeoff was delayed while the plane was being refueled by 3 trucks. Mucklow, ordered to stay with Cooper, noted that he started to complain and feel a little bit uncomfortable about how long the refueling was taking. He'd leaned over several times and said,
"Come on, it shouldn't be taking this long. It's time to get this show on the road."
Cooper was ready to go. He was also concerned that the money had been delivered to him in a cloth bag rather than a knapsack, which he'd originally requested. Due to this oversight, Cooper said that he's going to have to find another way to transport the money. He pulls out a pocket knife and Cooper cuts the canopy from one of the reserve parachutes and stuffs some of the money in an empty parachute bag. Eventually, the refueling is completed and Captain Scott receives instructions that he is able to take off. After takeoff, Cooper then sends another set of specific instructions to the captain. He requests that they fly on a southeast course towards Mexico City. Now this is to be done with the slowest possible airspeed without stalling the plane, and an absolute maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. Cooper also insists that the landing gear must remain deployed at all times, with the wing flaps lowered to 15 degrees, and keep the cabin unpressurized. The first officer informs Cooper that this configuration is going to severely limit the aircraft's range to about 1,000 miles, so if they're going to do this, they're going to need a second refueling before Mexico. Cooper debates this, and there's a bit of back and forth as they discuss options. Eventually, it's agreed that they'll stop at Reno Tahoe International Airport, and that will be the next refueling stop. So, by the time Flight 305 took off again, it was now about 7:40 in the evening. The flight was tailed by 3 jets who stayed in an S pattern behind the slowly moving plane. This kept them out of Cooper's view. Slowly after takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to go and lower the aft staircase. She told him the flight crew feared that she'd be sucked straight out of the aircraft. Understandably, Mucklow was pretty terrified at this point. She suggests that she can go to the cockpit and retrieve an emergency rope. She'd then use that rope to tie herself to her seat, but Cooper rejected this. He said that he didn't want her going up and down the plane, nor did he want the flight crew coming back into the cabin. She proposed a second option. Cooper could cut some cord from one of the parachutes and create a safety line for her. Cooper again rejected this request, eventually telling her to just go into the cockpit and he'll do it himself. Before she disappeared into the cockpit, she turned to Cooper and begged him to take the bomb with him. Cooper responded that he'd either disarm it or he would in fact take it with him. As Mucklow walks up to the cockpit, she turns to close the curtain partition and takes one last look at Cooper. Cooper's now standing in the aisle and tying the money bag around his waist. He's looking straight out towards the aft stairs. He's ready. At about 8 o'clock in the cockpit, the warning light starts flashing, indicating the aft staircase has been deployed. The captain uses the cabin intercom to ask Cooper if he needs any assistance. Cooper simply replies, no. This is the last anyone ever heard of him. At about 8:13 p.m, the aircraft's tail section suddenly pitches forward. This forces the pilots to trim and return the aircraft to a level flight. With the cabin door still deployed, the flight crew remained in the cockpit, unsure if Cooper was still around. Mucklow again used the cabin intercom to inform Cooper that they're approaching the airport. He needed to raise the stairs so that they could land safely. They had no reply from Cooper. At 11:02 p.m, with the staircase still deployed, Flight 305 finally landed. FBI agents, state troopers, sheriff deputies, and Reno police established a perimeter around the aircraft. Fearing the hijacker and the bomb were still on board, they did not approach the plane at first. Slowly, Captain Scott emerges from the cockpit and searches the cabin. Cooper was nowhere to be seen, and after a 30-minute search, an FBI bomb squad declared the cabin safe. Cooper had done it. He was gone, and all that was left behind was a black clip-on tie, a tie clip, 2 of the 4 parachutes, and some cigarette butts. The manhunt begins. In order to track down Cooper, they needed to know exactly who they were looking for. At first, the FBI used eyewitness testimony to draw up a profile of Cooper. This profile was then used to draw sketches of Cooper, which would be released to investigation teams and the public. This wasn't without issue, and 3 iterations of sketch was created from November 1971 through to 1973. Releasing sketches to only withdraw them, then release another one, did not help speed up the investigation, and this hampered early investigations. In short, they were looking for a man about 5 feet 10 inches tall, in his mid-40s, black combed hair, an olive-toned skin, and no particular accent. The FBI also had to hone in on a parameter to look for Cooper. This too proved very difficult. The night Cooper jumped, there were a number of variables in place. The estimates of the plane's airspeed varied greatly. Environmental conditions along the path also varied, as did the aircraft's location and altitude. On top of this, only Cooper really knows how long he was in freefall for before pulling the ripcord. All of these would have a great effect on where he ended up. The pilots of the 3 jets that were trailing Flight 305 did not see Cooper jump. It had been a pitch black night with limited visibility, cloud cover, and no ground lighting. There was no visual confirmation of Cooper anywhere. To combat this, the FBI ran several simulations to try and recreate the variables of that evening. The cabin crew at the time had reported a change in cabin air pressure. This happened at about 8:13 that night, and it had caused a slight upward motion in the tail section of the craft. The FBI were able to replicate this effect during their simulations. They now had a likely time that Cooper jumped. After initial experimentation, they extrapolated that Cooper's landing zone was somewhere a few miles southeast of a small town called Ariel, Washington. The FBI agents and sheriff deputies searched large areas of heavily wooded terrain on foot and by helicopter. Door-to-door searches were also carried out. Other search parties ran patrol boats around Lake Merwin and Yale Lake. Neither Cooper nor any of the equipment he was carrying was found. Many other searches were carried out down the years of this area and other areas. Any evidence that was found seemed subjective and never led them to Cooper. With such a vast area of wilderness to search and difficult weather conditions, the FBI found no evidence of Cooper, nor the items he was carrying. With such difficulty, they decided to turn their focus to the money they'd given Cooper. As mentioned, they'd logged all the serial numbers of the notes given to Cooper, and they all began with L. The serial numbers were passed to several financial institutions, government agencies, and the general public. This would make it very difficult for Cooper to actually spend any of the money. The money never turned up officially in circulation. But almost a decade later, some of the money was found. In early 1980, a young boy was building a small campfire on a beach outside of Washington. As the boy was digging into the sand, he found several bundles of cash totaling nearly $6,000. The boy's parents handed the money into the FBI. The FBI investigated and found it was the money that had been given to Cooper. First off, this raised more questions than answers. The main question being how? The money that had been found was a long way away from the initial drop zone. This made investigators question the area they had marked as the drop zone, particularly as the money could not have gone from the drop zone to this location downstream. That would have gone against the current. There are many theories on how the money got to this location. Interestingly, the wads of cash were still wrapped in the plastic bands they were when the money was given to Cooper. Analysis conducted in 2009 showed that these rubber bands were not able to survive exposure to the elements, air or water, for more than 1 year. This means they must have been buried and submerged on that beach within at least a year of Cooper's jump. So this means the most likely scenario is that Cooper or someone else buried the money. This went against the FBI's suspicions that Cooper did not survive the jump. This evidence says that perhaps he did. Although there's no hard evidence for Cooper's death, nor his survival, it was the FBI's narrative that Cooper did not survive his jump. When Cooper jumped, it was pitch black. The ground below was not visible due to several layers of thick cloud. Cooper jumped from 10,000 feet and was wearing just his black suit. The winds were so aggressive that night that when Cooper lowered the aft stairs, a sign was ripped out from the inside of the plane. This sign was found on the ground, almost directly underneath the estimated flight path. Despite Cooper seemingly being confident with parachutes, his actual competency is still up for debate. Remember, Cooper had demanded 4 parachutes, 2 front parachutes and 2 back, or 2 reserve, 2 main. It's believed that he'd requested 4 to make the authorities think that he'd take a hostage with him. Even though the authorities had considered tampering with the parachutes, they decided it was too risky in case there was a hostage. However, they'd actually made a mistake in the parachutes that they'd given Cooper, and it was a detail that Cooper had failed to realise. They'd actually provided Cooper with 1 dummy chute, which is a training parachute that's sewn shut. This parachute was missing from the aircraft, so Cooper did take it with him. Interestingly, of the 2 main parachutes provided, Cooper took the older, slightly inferior chute. The older one he took was military grade and the other one was civilian, so perhaps this is another clue, indicating Cooper could have been a military man, which was strongly believed. Whoever Cooper was, he'd clearly planned this in relative detail. He requested 4 parachutes, indicating he might jump with a hostage. He wore dark glasses the majority of the time, to not show his eyes. Before he jumped, he reclaimed all of the notes that he wrote, so the only evidence of his handwriting was the Dan Cooper that he writ on his plane ticket. He ensured the rest of the passengers on the plane were not alerted to the fact a hijack was going down. During the hijacking, Cooper seemed to demonstrate extensive technical knowledge of aircraft and flying in general. There were also several landmarks that Cooper seemed to recognise from the air, as well as stating distances from locations to military Air Force bases. Despite the clear, detailed planning, there was also a number of oversights from Cooper's part, and the jumping from the plane feels like a jump and hope. Why didn't he request appropriate clothing? Why didn't he request a pair of boots? If there was a specific location he was trying to jump to, then why didn't he pass the details of the route to the captain? Even if Cooper did survive the fall and made it safely to the ground, he would have then had to trek through harsh terrain which was partially snow-covered, in his black suit. With all the things that seem to make perfect sense, there are just as many that don't make any sense in this case. So who on earth is, or was, D.B Cooper? Well, since 1971 to 2016, there have been 1,000 suspects of interest. Within the first 5 years of the case, there was 800. Some of these suspects carry some weight. One of these suspects was a man called Ted Braden. Braden was formerly in the Special Forces, he's a master skydiver, and he's also a convicted felon. Many within the Special Forces community believed Braden was Cooper. Braden joined the military at the age of 16, and he became one of the military's leading parachutists. Braden had been described as a man who had a secret death wish. A man who continually places himself in unnecessary danger, but always seems to get away with it. And during his time in Vietnam, he was described as continuously being involved in shady, money-making deals. It was known that in the 1970s he was investigated by the FBI for stealing $250,000 during a trucking scam that he'd allegedly devised. Braden's military records list him at about 5'8", which is shorter than the description of Cooper. However, he possessed a darker complexion, he had short dark hair, he had a medium athletic build, and he would have been about 43 years old at the time of hijacking. All of this lines up with descriptions of Cooper. Despite investigation and all of this detail, it could never be proved that Braden was D.B Cooper. He was never charged. Another person investigated was Richard McCoy Jr. McCoy had served in the US Army and he toured Vietnam twice. In his career in the armed forces, he was obsessed with recreational skydiving. One of the main things about McCoy is that he was a man that was caught in a copycat the very next year after D.B Cooper. In 1972, he boarded a plane with what appeared to be a hand grenade, and he demanded $500,000. Sadly for McCoy, he left evidence and his fingerprints everywhere, and was caught 2 years later and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Despite other elements of circumstantial evidence, McCoy could never be proved to be D.B Cooper. This is partly due to the fact he had a strong alibi for where he was during the night of Cooper's hijacking. He was at home and having Thanksgiving dinner with his family in Utah. He was never charged. A third man, named Robert Rackstraw, was also a retired pilot, an ex-convict, who again had served in the Vietnam War. He was also under suspicion. However, despite the FBI's suspicions, they could never link Rackstraw back to the hijacking. Another man of serious interest was Duane Weber. Weber was a repeat offender. He served at least 6 prison terms between 1945 and 1968. He was again an army veteran, and his widow proposed that he could be the man that everybody was searching for. Apparently, 3 days before his death in 1995, Weber told his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." Ultimately, there were similarities, and there were similarities with Cooper's handwriting too. But the FBI officially ruled him out when his fingerprints didn't match. These suspects aren't even a handful of the individuals the FBI have investigated, showing just how difficult it is when there's so little evidence. In 2016, the FBI admitted defeat and closed the case. So did Cooper really survive? I guess nobody knows, and perhaps no one ever will know. One thing's for certain, it's an incredible story, and one that seems to be destined to remain unsolved. The legend of D.B Cooper lives on. Thanks for watching the channel today. Remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and we will see you next time.